Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 6, Credit Diverts Production. As I've mentioned previously, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. I will put a link in this video's description to that series, so go ahead and check that out so you can keep up to date with us. Tonight we will be reading Chapter 6, which is kind of a long chapter, so you'll have to bear with me. As always, we will do our analysis and review after we finish our read. I will put that in the timestamps to this video in the video's description, so if you just want to jump to the analysis and review, you can go ahead and do that. Just one more quick piece of housekeeping before we get started. Chapter 6 is very long, so you have to bear with me. Not very long, but it's pretty long, so you have to bear with me. And it's broken up into 3 parts. Henry Hazlitt doesn't explicitly list the opening as part 1, so you're just going to have to assume that it's part 1. And I'll actually add in the words part 1 after we read the chapter title, which, of course, for Chapter 6 is Credit Diverts Production. Part 1. Government quote-unquote encouragement to business is sometimes as much to be feared as government hostility. The supposed encouragement often takes the form of a direct grant of government credit or a guarantee of private loans. The question of government credit can often be complicated because it involves the possibility of inflation. We shall defer analysis of the effects of inflation of various kinds until a later chapter. Here, for the sake of simplicity, we shall assume that the credit we are discussing is non-inflationary. Inflation, as we shall see later, while it complicates the analysis, does not at bottom change the consequences of the policies discussed. A frequent proposal of this sort in Congress is for more credit to farmers. In the eyes of most congressmen, the farmers simply cannot get enough credit. The credit supplied by private mortgage companies, insurance companies, or country banks is never quote-unquote adequate. Congress is always finding new gaps that are not filled by the existing lending institutions, no matter how many of these it has itself already brought into existence. The farmers may have enough long-term credit or enough short-term credit, but it turns out they have not enough intermediate credit, or the interest rate is too high, or the complaint is that private loans are made only to rich and well-established farmers. So new lending institutions and new types of farm loans are piled on top of each other by the legislature. The faith in all these policies, it will be found, springs from 2 acts of short-sightedness. One is to look at the matter only from the standpoint of the farmers that borrowed. The other is to think only of the first half of the transaction. Now all loans, in the eyes of honest borrowers, must eventually be repaid. All credit is debt. Proposals for an increased volume of credit, therefore, are merely another name for proposals for an increased burden of debt. They would seem considerably less inviting if they were habitually referred to by the second name instead of by the first. We need not discuss here the normal loans that are made to farmers through private sources. They consist of mortgages, of installment credits for the purchase of automobiles, refrigerators, TV sets, tractors, and other farm machinery, and of bank loans made to carry the farmer along until he is able to harvest and market his crop and get paid for it. Here we need concern ourselves only with loans to farmers either made directly by some government bureau or guaranteed by it. These loans are of 2 main types. One is a loan to enable the farmer to hold his crop off the market. This is an especially harmful type, but it will be more convenient to consider it later when we come to the question of government commodity controls. The other is a loan to private capital, often to set the farmer up in business by enabling him to buy the farm itself, or a mule or tractor, or all 3. At first glance, the case for this type of loan may seem a strong one. Here is a poor family, it will be said, with no means of livelihood. It is cruel and wasteful to put them in relief. Buy a farm for them, set them up in business, make productive and self-respecting citizens of them. Let them add to the total national product or pay the loan off out of what they produce. Or, here is a farmer struggling along with primitive methods of production because he has not the capital to buy himself a tractor. Lend him the money for one. Let him increase his productivity. He can repay the loan out of the proceeds of his increased crops. In that way, you not only enrich him and put him on his feet, you enrich the whole community by that much added output. And the loan, concludes the argument, costs the government and the taxpayers less than nothing because it is quote-unquote self-liquidating. Now, as a matter of fact, that is what happens every day under the institution of private credit. If a man wishes to buy a farm, he has, let us say, only half or a third as much money as the farm costs. A neighbor or savings bank will lend him the rest in the form of a mortgage on the farm. If he wishes to buy a tractor, the tractor company itself, or a finance company, will allow him to buy it for 1/3 of the purchase price, with the rest to be paid off in installments out of earnings that the tractor itself will help provide. But there is a decisive difference between the loans supplied by private lenders and loans supplied by a government agency. Each private lender risks his own funds. A banker, it is true, risks the funds of others that have been entrusted to him, but if money is lost, he must either make good out of it, out of his own funds, or be forced out of business. When people risk their own funds, they are usually careful in their investigations to determine the adequacy of the assets pledged and the business acumen and honesty of the borrower. If the government operated by the same strict standards, there would be no good argument for its entering the field at all. Why do precisely what private agencies already do? But the government almost invariably operates by different standards. The whole argument for its entering the lending business, in fact, is that it will make loans to people who could not get them from private lenders. This is only another way of saying that the government lenders will take risks with other people's money, the taxpayers' money, that private lenders will not take with their own money. Sometimes, in fact, apologists will freely acknowledge that the percentage of losses will be higher on these government loans than on private loans. But they contend that this will be more than offset by the added production brought into existence by the borrowers who pay back, and even by most of the borrowers who do not pay back. This argument will seem plausible only as long as we can concentrate our attention on the particular borrowers whom the government supplies with funds and overlook the people whom its plan deprives of funds. For what is really being lent is not money, which is merely the medium of exchange, but capital. I have already put the reader on notice that we shall postpone to a later point the complications introduced by an inflationary expansion of credit. What is really being lent, say, is the farm or the tractor itself. Now the number of farms in existence is limited, and so the production of tractors, assuming especially that an economic surplus of tractors is not produced simply at the expense of other things. The farmer or tractor that is lent to A cannot be lent to B. The real question is, therefore, whether A or B shall get the farm. This brings us to the respective merits of A and B, and what each contributes, or is capable of contributing, to production. A, let us say, is the man who would get the farm if the government did not intervene. The local banker or his neighbors know him and know his record. They want to find employment for their funds. They know that he's a good farmer and an honest man who keeps his word. They consider him a good risk. He has already, perhaps, through industry, frugality, and foresight, accumulated enough cash to pay 1/4 of the price of the farm. They lend him the other 3/4, and he gets the farm. There is a strange idea abroad, held by all monetary cranks, that credit is something a banker gives to a man. Credit, on the contrary, is something a man already has. He has it, perhaps, because he already has marketable assets of a greater cash value than the loan for which he is asking. Or he has it because his character and past record have earned it. He brings it into the bank with him. That is why the banker makes him the loan. The banker is not giving something for nothing. He feels assured of repayment. He is merely exchanging a more liquid form of asset or credit for a less liquid form. Sometimes he makes a mistake, and then it is not only the banker who suffers, but the whole community. For values which were supposed to be produced by the lender are not produced, and resources are wasted. Now it is to say A, let us say, who has credit, that the banker would make his loan. But the government goes into the lending business in a charitable frame of mind because, as we say, it is worried about B. B cannot get a mortgage or other loans from private lenders because he does not have credit with them. He has no savings, he has no impressive record as a good farmer, he is perhaps at the moment on relief. Why not, say the advocates of government credit, make him a useful and productive member of society by lending him enough for a farm and a mule or tractor and setting him up in business? Perhaps in an individual case it might work out all right. But it is obvious that in general, the people selected by these government standards will be poorer risks than the people selected by private standards. More money will be lost by loans to them. There will be a much higher percentage of failures among them. They will be less efficient. More resources will be wasted by them. Yet the recipients of government credit will get their farms and tractors at the expense of those who otherwise would have been the recipients of private credit. Because B has a farm, A will be deprived of a farm. A may be squeezed out either because interest rates have gone up as a result of the government operations, or because farm prices have been forced up as a result of them, or because there is no other farm to be had in his neighborhood. In any case, the net result of government credit has not been to increase the amount of wealth produced by the community, but to reduce it, because the available real capital, consisting of actual farms, tractors, etc., has been placed in the hands of the less efficient borrowers rather than in the hands of the more efficient and trustworthy. Part 2. The case becomes even clearer if we turn from farming to other forms of business. The proposal is frequently made that the government ought to assume the risks that are quote-unquote too great for private industry. This means that bureaucrats should be permitted to take risks with taxpayers' money that no one is willing to make with his own. Such a policy would lead to evils of many different kinds. It would lead to favoritism, to the making of loans to friends or in return for bribes. It would inevitably lead to scandals. It would lead to recriminations whenever the taxpayers' money was thrown away on enterprises that failed. It would increase the demand for socialism, for it would properly be asked, if the government is going to bear the risks, why should it not also get the profits? What justification could there possibly be, in fact, for asking the taxpayers to take the risks while permitting private capitalists to keep the profits? This is precisely, however, as we shall see later, what we already do in the case of non-recourse government loans to farmers. But we shall pass over all these evils for the moment and concentrate on just one consequence of loans of this type. This is that they will waste capital and reduce production. They will throw the available capital into bad or at best dubious projects. They will throw it into the hands of persons who are less competent or less trustworthy than those who would otherwise have got it. For the amount of real capital at any moment, as distinguished from monetary tokens run off in a printing press, is limited. What is put into the hands of B cannot be put into the hands of A. People want to invest their own capital, but they are cautious. They want to get it back. Most lenders, therefore, investigate any proposal carefully before they risk their own money in it. They may sometimes make mistakes, but for several reasons, they are likely to make fewer mistakes than government lenders. In the first place, the money is either their own or has been voluntarily entrusted to them. In the case of government lending, the money is that of other people, and it has been taken from them regardless of their personal wish in taxes. The private money will be invested only where repayment with interest or profit is definitely expected. This is a sign that the persons to whom the money has been lent will be expected to produce things for the market that people actually want. The government money, on the other hand, is likely to be lent for some vague general purpose like, quote-unquote, creating employment, and the more inefficient the work, that is, the greater the volume of employment it requires in relation to the value of the product, the more highly thought of the investment is likely to be. The private lenders, moreover, are selected by a cruel market test. If they make bad mistakes, they lose their money and have no more money to be lent. It is only if they have been successful in the past that they have more money to lend in the future. Thus, private lenders, except the relatively small proportion that have got their funds through inheritance, are rigidly selected by a process of survival of the fittest. The government lenders, on the other hand, are either those who have passed civil service examinations and know how to answer hypothetical questions hypothetically, or they are those who can give the most plausible reasons for making loans and the most plausible explanations of why it wasn't their fault that the loans failed. But the net result remains. Private loans will utilize existing resources and capital far better than government loans. Government loans will waste far more capital and resources than private loans. Government loans, in short, as compared with private loans, will reduce production, not increase it. The proposal for government loans to private individuals or projects, in brief, sees B and forgets A. It sees the people into whose hands the capital is put. It forgets those who would otherwise have had it. It sees the project to which the capital is granted. It forgets the projects from which the capital is thereby withheld. It sees the immediate benefit to one group. It overlooks the losses to other groups and the net loss to the community as a whole. The case against government-guaranteed loans and mortgages to private businesses and persons is almost as strong as, though less obvious than, the case against direct government loans and mortgages. The advocates of government-guaranteed mortgages also forget that what is being lent is ultimately real capital, which is limited in supply, and that they are helping identified B at the expense of some unidentified A. Government-guaranteed home mortgages, especially when a negligible down payment or no down payment whatsoever is required, inevitably mean more bad loans than otherwise. They force the general taxpayer to subsidize the bank risks and to defray the losses. They encourage people to buy houses that they cannot really afford. They tend eventually to bring about an oversupply of houses as compared with other things. They temporarily overstimulate building, raise the cost of building for everybody, including the buyers of the homes with the guaranteed mortgages, and may mislead the building industry into an eventually costly overexpansion. In brief, in the long run, they do not increase overall national production, but encourage malinvestment. Part 3. We remarked at the beginning of this chapter that government aid to business is sometimes as much to be feared as government hostility. This applies as much to government subsidies as to government loans. The government never lends or gives anything to business that it does not take away from business. One often hears new dealers and other statists boast about the way government, quote-unquote, bailed business out with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and other government agencies in 1932 and later. But the government can give no financial help to business that it does not first or finally take from business. The government's funds all come from taxes. Even the much vaunted, quote-unquote, government credit rests on the assumption that its loans will ultimately be repaid out of the proceeds of taxes. When the government makes loans or subsidies to business, what it does is to tax successful private business in order to support unsuccessful private business. Under certain emergency circumstances, there may be a plausible argument for this, the merits of which we need not examine here. But in the long run, it does not sound like a paying proposition from the standpoint of the country as a whole, and experience has shown that it isn't. All right, that concludes the read for today, which was Chapter 6. On to the analysis and review. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So there's kind of a lot to get out of this chapter, and since the read itself was kind of on the long side, I'm going to try my best to be brief. But before we get started with this chapter, credit is something that's very poorly understood in common parlance. So I won't get into what credit is in great detail. We might actually have an opportunity for that later on in this series. But just as a brief primer for Chapter 6, before we really get into the content here, credit comes from within. It comes from the things that you've done, the character that you've exemplified, what you have, and what you could potentially produce. So whenever you have this conversation of credit, I want you guys to think about Steve-O. Everybody knows Jackass is Steve-O. Okay. When it comes to the question of evaluating credit, Steve-O is the perfect example to use because we have Steve-O of the Jackass years when he was on every drug imaginable and blowing through money in the most frivolous and wasteful of manners. And then we have Steve-O of today, who's perfectly straight edge and whose YouTube channel now has, I can't tell you how many hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and whose show and whose acts are now making him millions of dollars. Steve-O is now a rich man, and it has nothing to do with his experience and tenure with Jackass, because his experience and tenure with Jackass financially was a colossal drain. So who would you rather invest in? Steve-O 2020 or Steve-O 2003? I think the answer is pretty obvious. If you were going to give a $100,000 loan to Steve-O in 2003, I think we all know what would happen with that $100,000. It would go up his nose, if not up in flames. Whereas today, that $100,000 investment is going to go towards his business, where he has an actual financial planner, where he has people who oversee the financial aspects of the business and the marketing and strategic planning side of the business. So whenever we talk about credit and the extension of credit, remember to use Steve-O as an example. So what credit is, when we talk about in financial terms, is an assessment of risk. So when you look at somebody's personal credit, it's the likelihood, if they have a very high credit, it means they have a very high likelihood of whenever you issue a debt to them, of repaying back that debt. So when you have the conversation of credit, it has to start with the conversation of risk. I was only starting with Steve-O so you guys can envision how that would manifest. So in the case of Steve-O was a very high risk investment in 2003. In 2020, he's not a very high risk investment. In fact, he's very low risk investment. Risk is the likelihood of insolvency of the funds that are being lent. Oh, that's the financial term that might have gone over some people's heads. Risk is the likelihood that the money that you give to somebody is going to go up in smoke, that they just simply won't pay back the loan. In the case of the stock market, there's very high risk because if you invest in, say, let's say Amazon, let's take something blue chip. There's a likelihood that the value will eventually reach zero, and then you lose everything. There's no way to get that money back, with extremely extraordinary exceptions to those circumstances. However, if you invest in a mutual fund, which has a little bit in Amazon, and a little bit in Google, and a little bit in Microsoft, and a little bit in Apple, and a little bit in a ton of other companies, you've diversified that risk, which means that the risk of any one of those companies defaulting or dissolving might be relatively high or relatively low, but the likelihood that all of them are going to completely dissolve is very low, especially when the funds that you're investing into can change over time, which means that even if half of those companies dissolve utterly, then there are other companies you can then divest into, which means that the investment portfolio in terms of the amount invested in each company shrinks, but you invested in more companies. In doing so, what you've actually done is decreased that risk. You've mitigated that risk. We'll talk about deferral of risk in a minute, but in that case, you've actually lowered the risk. The other thing to take into consideration with risk, and it segues naturally into the actual read itself. When you have an investment that is very high risk, Steve-O 2003, you expect a very high return, which means Steve-O in 2003, if he's given a $100,000 loan, is going to get a borderline usurious rate if anyone is even willing to lend to him. Usurious meaning like illegally high. Whereas if you were to invest in a loan in Steve-O today, you'd probably be willing to do it at a fairly low rate. In fact, in the case of Steve-O, he's such a good investment that in the case of extending a loan, Steve-O knows with his financial manager that they're going to go out and shop for loans, which means that the lenders are going to have to compete for Steve-O, which means that in case of Steve-O 2020, you're not going to say, well, I'm just going to gouge you because I can afford to gouge you, because he'll find another lender, which means that you actually have to have that interest rate set fairly low. But again, Steve-O 2003, somebody you don't even want to lend to, and you know that you're probably going to be the only one competing for that loan. And even if you aren't, you don't have to set a really low threshold in order to be competitive in that market for the lending of money of assets to Steve-O. So in the case of a free market, the way that we allocate scarce resources is with prices. So in the case of the allocation of loans, who can get loans? There's only so much money to lend out, let's say, right? And there is only so much money to lend out. And that's true of all banks. And that's true of society as a whole. There's only so much money to lend out. So if a bank wants to lend to Steve-O and looks at Steve-O 2000, let's say we have a DeLorean. We can get Steve-O 2003 brought to 2020, right? What is the price that Steve-O would have to pay to get a loan today if we're talking Steve-O 2003? It's a very high price. That interest rate is going to be incredibly high. So in that case, the prices have allocated who's going to get that loan. Well, if Steve-O looks at that loan and says, I can't afford 30% interest. I can't afford, a 19.9% APY. I'm not paying back that loan. Screw that. That's him saying, I can't afford to lend to you. The other thing is that maybe there's only $100,000 to lend, and maybe the bank gets to choose between lending to Steve-O 2003 and Steve-O 2020. Okay, well, Steve-O 2020, I'm not willing to take a loan out for more than 4%. Steve-O 2003, I'm not willing to take a loan out for more than 4%. So who's going to wind up with a loan? Honestly, it's probably going to be Steve-O 2020, because the bank is willing to send out that loan to Steve-O 2003 at 30%, but Steve-O's not willing to take it at 30%. Steve-O 2020 might be willing to take out a loan at 4%. Let's say fixed APY over 20 years, right? Over 15 years. In the case of Steve-O today, though, a $100,000 loan would be an almost payday loan because he has so much money. That's how markets, when it comes to credit, allocate scarce resources. And we can refer back to Smith's lesson, right? That when you have a system where that is entirely voluntary, where the prices are, the agreement to that loan is done in an entirely mutually consensual manner, we know that those risks those scarce resources are axiomatically being allocated in the most efficient means possible. In this case, the market influences, right, which are when a bank has to respond to market influences. In the case of these two Steve-Os, it has to respond to the fact that that they're both Steve-Os, let's say, are only willing to accept a loan at 4% interest. Well, in that case, then all the loans are going to Steve-O 2020. And it tells us the actual willingness of the people in that case. So it tells us the will of the people in that case. We don't have to have an election. We don't have to have any votes. The vote is cast by the wallet. Steve-O 2003's wallet can only afford 4% interest. Steve-O 2020 could probably afford more, but he's only willing to pay 4% because he knows the banks can have to compete over his interest, over the rate that they're going to wind up charging him in terms of interest. This actually segues naturally into it's a huge part of why we have representative and democratic democracies rather than totalitarian states, because at least when it comes to something where you have to respond to an electorate, say an election day, that is in some ways a market influence. It is in some way an influence of the people who constitute what would be the exchange processes that make up the market. Whereas in a totalitarian and monarchical regime, they don't have to respond to anything. They rule by their own dictate and by nothing else, which is why we call these dictatorships. So in the case of government loans, which is what this entire chapter is about. So I know we've spent about 10 minutes just doing our prep for the actual contents of the chapter. But in the case of what this chapter is actually about, which is government loans or government-backed loans, what we're talking about is a mere deferral of risk. So the risk that is being assumed by the lender in this case is being deferred onto the government. So in this case, even when we're talking about private sector loans, right, that $100,000 loan that's being given by the bank, if the government is backing that loan, well, then there's no risk actually assumed by the bank. It's assumed by the government, which in turn is passed on to us. This, of course, is going to axiomatically lead to what would be there's going to be an inflationary effect, and that's bad. And we'll get into why that is in future reads. Hazlitt explains that he gets into that in future reads. So the first note we have, just as a side note, we're going to get into government-backed loans in greater detail and probably in another chapter rather than simply government-issued loans. Here we need to concern ourselves only with loans to farmers either made directly by some government bureau or guaranteed by it. That's page 41. There is a minor difference between the two in terms of practice, but in terms of outcome, it's not really substantially different. The only difference is that the people making the loans in this case are not answerable really to anyone because they're private lenders. In this case, the government backs the loans and there's nothing to respond to. There's no elected officials determining whether or not these loans are going to be issued. So in this case, the government is going to assume the risk. And that's true of government-backed loans, and that's true of government-issued loans. In this case, these are loans that, if there was no government, they would just simply be made in the free market. Again, this is axiomatically and self-evidently true by the existence of these loans in the first place and of lending agencies in the first place. So if you think up the people that make up the voting population, if they were to simply, of their own accordance and free will, co-op themselves together and form a lending agency of some sort. We don't need to get into what those lending agencies necessarily would be. They don't have to be banks. They can be credit agencies or just generic neighborhood lending agencies. And if there's some licensure laws, again, they complicate this conversation, but that doesn't really change the fact that in this case, if you're voting for the government to issue the loan, then you are suggesting that the tax money that you are offering is money that you would be willing to give in the loan. So in that case, if there was a free market, and there is, then your willingness would be reflected by the fact that you are actually lending to these agencies. And since you aren't, that's an indicator that the actual most efficient way to allocate those scarce resources, your tax dollars, which are scarce resources, is to actually axiomatically not engage in that type of lending. And that's because you're obviously not true. If you've ever heard the bet me meme. So if you are actually willing let's say you're predicting the outcome of a basketball game, a college basketball game, and you think that Duke is going to beat North Carolina this year or whatever. And you're absolutely emphatic about it. You're absolutely certain. Then someone might respond with, okay, bet me. Put your money where your mouth is. If you really think that this person is somebody that should be lent to with your tax dollars, bet me. Go ahead and make that loan. Determine the interest rate you're willing to offer. And if you can't make it yourself, of course, then get all of those people that are on your proverbial side together to coalesce, to form a co-op, if you will, and let's see where this goes. And the truth is that since they're obviously and self-evidently not willing to do that, then in this case, then we're not talking about something that is actually a reflection of the people. We have something that is a market influence, which is the risk that these people are going to see being incurred by pooling that money together and lending it out to somebody. And that market influence is something that cooperative group has to respond to. In this case, the credit of the person that they're issuing to is another form of a market influence. In the case of government, you don't have to respond to market influences. At the end of the day, the government has a gun. And at the end of the day, the difference between market transactions and government transactions are that the government can simply force you to, in the end, to engage in them. The government is, if it's a proper government, nothing more than a repository for violence, and should, in a ideal society, have a monopoly over violence. Which means that in the end of the day, if you don't pay back your loan to a bank, the bank has to assume that the loan has been defaulted on, and they have a very limited array of choices to make up for that loss. Whereas the government can either print money, which banks can't do, or use the threat of actual violent force, or use actual violent force to make good on that loan. So this is one of the built-in flaws. We've talked. So I think this should segue naturally into the built-in flaws of government lending, and those flaws which Hazlitt lists in brief on page 40. Is it 45? I think it is 45. But for several reasons, they are likely to make fewer mistakes than government lenders. He's talking about private lenders are likely to make fewer mistakes than government lenders on page 45. And then he lists some of these reasons in brief. The short version is that private lenders in the private sector have to respond to market influences, or they cease to exist. Government does not have to respond to market influences. It can continue to exist even if it doesn't respond to them. We know this as a result. We know this from monarchies. Monarchies persisted for hundreds, if not thousands of years in certain cases, and these kings had nothing to respond to. Again, they ruled by the whim of their own dictates, which is what makes them dictators. The result, of course, because the government doesn't have to, so the short version of the entire chapter is government doesn't have to respond to market influences, and that's what makes these government loans extremely inefficient relative to private loans, and is why it is a bad idea to really be engaging these in large scale from an economic standpoint. The result, of course, is that you're going to have an inflationary effect. And we'll get into greater detail on that in later chapters, but as Hazlitt explains, but the short version is that because these loans are being issued less efficiently, and that's axiomatically true because we don't have a mutual consent here. We don't necessarily have mutual consent here. The result is that because you're going to be defaulting on more of these loans than you would otherwise be, that it needs to be made up somehow. And basically the only way to do that is to either engage in force, which we've discussed in previous chapters, hurts the economy and decreases productivity long term, or to simply print money, which of course is going to have a negative inflationary effect. This is actually, I wish he would talk in this chapter about, so this is kind of a bit of the review, about the same effect happening in colleges. So we're going to get into this in greater detail, I think, in a future chapter. But the short version is that the reason that the colleges have gotten so expensive over the years is because that risk has been deferred from these private lenders to government because the government is backing these loans. Well, then the banks are, of course, private lenders are, of course, going to give as many of these loans as they possibly can away, which means that because they're given as many of these loans away as they possibly can, there's no risk. Then it's basically guaranteed money to these colleges. So a place like Duke, which is a private institution, has a built-in incentive to take in as many college students as they possibly can at that point, because that's just free money. Every student that pays tuition is going to guarantee, the colleges are guaranteed that money. If they're not guaranteed that money, that means they have to compete for the students. If you remove the element of market competition, you wind up saturating the market, and you inflate demand in that case. So what winds up happening is everyone who wants to go to college gets into college. Entrance requirements get dropped, graduation requirements decline, and as a result, everybody and their mother has a degree, so the degree means nothing. And on top of all that, because everyone is going and it's free money, these universities have no incentive to decrease their tuition rates, because the banks are going to pay that money off through a government backed loan, and the government is just going to continue to print money on those loans that don't get paid. Which is why you see such horrible payback rates and payback times on these loans. And this is so this is going to be one of the results of government lending, is the inflationary effect, which we're going to get into in later chapters. But that's the very short version. The other result is that government is going to make more mistakes. And Hazlitt explains this in two parts on page 45 and on 42. But for several reasons, they may... Okay, so he explains that already. And then on page 42... Sometimes, in fact, apologists will freely acknowledge that the percentage of losses will be higher on these government loans than on private loans. So, in many cases, people are willing to admit that these loans are issued at much higher default rates. And the other problem is that if you take this idea to its logical end, it brings you to some areas that you probably wouldn't like, and people wouldn't normally associate with this type of lending. This means that, all right, so on page 45, he explains, this means that bureaucrats should be permitted to take risks with taxpayers' money that no one is willing to make on his own. This is what we talked about with Smith's lesson, and how we get to what people actually are willing to spend. And if the government is going to bear the risks, why should it not also get the profits? And he explains that it would inevitably lead to scandals. It would lead to recriminations whenever the taxpayers' money was thrown away on enterprises that failed. It would increase the demand for socialism, because if the government is going to bear the risks, why should it not also get the profits? So this is inherently going to be the basis for socialist programs. For a socialist move, if you will, through these programs. That's why these type of programs are often given the label socialist programs, and that's because that's where they tend to lead. That is their tendency. That is their trend towards socialism. And I would consider that a bad thing. You can at home decide if you consider socialism a bad thing, but the reality is that's an accurate way of describing these type of loans in this type of government endeavor. And remember that the credit comes from within. We talked about this at the beginning of the chapter, and Hazlitt explains this in brief on page 44. Why not, say the advocates of government credit, make him a useful and productive member of society by lending him enough money for a farm and a mule or a tractor and setting him up a business? You can't, as government, make useful people through these type of practices. Giving someone money isn't going to make them useful. What it will do is it will make their character flaws and virtues significantly magnified. So in the case of Steve-O, do you think giving Steve-O 2003 a ton of money is going to make him a better man? Or do you think it's going to give him the opportunity to do as much ketamine as he can possibly get his hands on? Let's be honest. He's going to blow that money in ketamine and coke. Steve-O 2020, however, is going to put that to the most productive means that Steve-O 2020 could possibly conceive of. So in this case, the money is just going to magnify Steve-O's virtues in 2020 and his flaws in 2003. Which means that when you have money, right, money won't change you internally. It will just make you more obvious. It will reveal your inner soul. That's all it will do. Which is why there's so much recidivism in these type of lending when you give loans out to the people who are less credit worthy. Their credit is not improved by the actual lending. Their credit score might improve, but that score is just a rating of the credit. It's not necessarily the credit itself. So no, you will not make better men by giving them money. Feed a man a fish, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. There's the second half of that story is that if you just perpetually give a man a fish, he will only consume and produce as much fish as he was already producing. Whereas if you teach the man to fish, if you make him change internally, then his level of productivity will improve. And that's the only way to do that. In the case of Steve-O 2003 versus Steve-O 2020, Steve-O in a free market, in order to get that loan, will either do the things within him that will improve his credit and make him a more competitive investment. Maybe if Steve-O 2003 and Steve-O 2020 are both only willing to engage in a loan at 4%, if Steve-O 2003 makes himself a more credible, not lender, if he makes himself a more credible man, then maybe I'm more willing to give that 4% interest rate to Steve-O 2003 because there's less likelihood that he's going to default on it. And maybe he's so credible that he won't pay it back in 15 years. He'll pay it back in 10, which is great for me because then I have those 5 years to lend out the other half of that loan, which I've already made my money on. So in this case, the free market system has created a moral system. Either you will be a decent human being or you will, as the proverb goes, starve. Either you will improve yourself from within, which we can't do to human beings. This is why addiction is such a challenge. People who are addicts have to look inside themselves and make the decision not for their kids, not for their family, not for the world, not for some ethereal notion, but for themselves. This is why addiction is so hard. These type of internal changes have to come from within. And the free market system is the only one that actually responds to what are, in this case, aspects of market influences. In this case, the free market system winds up creating the only moral system. And the final result, as Hazlitt explains on page 46, the final result is that government loans, in short, as compared with private loans, will reduce production, not increase it. Now remember that he's not making an argument against government loans and government-backed loans entirely. He's making an argument against the notion that government-issued credit increases productivity overall. In fact, it does the exact opposite. It at best diverts that production to less efficient means. It allocates those scarce resources in a less efficient manner. And of course, he explains at the very end of the chapter that there are under certain emergency circumstances, there may be a plausible argument for this, the merits of which we need not examine here. But in the long run, it does not sound like a paying proposition from the standpoint of the country as a whole, and experience has shown that it isn't. So I can think of a perfect example of when lending to, let's say, an arms manufacturer, rather than say an automobile manufacturer in 1944, might be a better loan in the long run because you're trying to win a war. And the result is, of course, that it might not economically pay out, but when you have the existential crisis that is the threat of human life with the war, it's at a certain point you are willing to absorb that cost for the reward of winning the war. So this is kind of just an introductory lesson in credit, and we will get into greater detail on that moving forward. There is a flaw in that this book was published originally in 1946, so I would have loved to, and this is, I guess, part of the review, seen his take on this lesson as it applies to government-backed college loans and why college has gotten so extravagantly, extremely expensive and has increased in cost well in excess of the CPI. And I wish there was more to expand upon within the lesson, but I realize that he's also trying to give these lessons in short pieces in a very introductory level and in a way that's fairly digestible. So we've gone on plenty long enough here. I see we're just about 30 minutes. So that has been Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, Chapter 6. Hope you've enjoyed, and we will see you in the next one. Night, folks.